welcome everybody to this webinar called System Shift, Insights from the Galapagos Islands. And as I mentioned, I'm Wayne Visser, and I have different hats that I wear, but where I am today is in Porto, where I am at Católica Porto Business School, where I'm a professor of practice in regenerative business innovation and technology, and also running a new center here called the Center for Thriving Futures. And this is also the umbrella for our session today. So great to be with you. And like Sally Uren, who joins me, I've been in this sustainability game for a long time, more than 30 years, and always been fascinated by systems change. And that's really what we're going to explore today. Before I hand over to Sally, let me give you an idea of the structure of today's 1-hour session. And that is that we will kick off shortly with a presentation of around 15 minutes from Sally, introducing us to some of the fundamental concepts of systems change. And then I will follow up with some additional insights, more from the innovation and technology perspective. We'll then have a short conversation between us about how some of this applies to the Galapagos Islands, where Sally has been for the last week or so, and is still today at this moment. And I'm looking forward to those insights. And then we'll open it up in the last 15 minutes or so to have some questions or comments from you. Of course, at any point, feel free to use the chat and to add your comments or insights there. All right, so thank you once again for joining us, and let me now hand over to Sally, who will introduce herself and kick us off with the opening presentation.
Great, thank you, Wayne. Hi, everybody. Great that you could join us today. I'm Sally Uren. I'm Executive Director at Forum for the Future, where I've been working now for about 25 years, actually. So I joined Forum early on in its origination, and Forum, for those of you that don't know, we're a sustainable development non-profit. We work in Europe, in the US, Singapore, and India. We're pretty small, 65 people across those 4 geographies, but with a very big ambition, and that is to accelerate transformation towards, we used to talk about a just and regenerative future, a sustainable future, but we now talk about a just and regenerative future, get that in the right order. So yeah, and I'm calling in from the Galapagos Islands. I'm a trustee of the Galapagos Conservation Trust. And in that capacity, I was running workshops yesterday using very similar slides to these, but translated into Spanish, and really bringing this concept of systems change into the work of the Galapagos Conservation Trust here on the islands. So I'm going to just give you a really brief overview of what we mean by systems change and what does a systems approach look like, and then hand back to Wayne. Because we often hear the conversation about systems change, systems, but we sometimes find out we have quite different interpretations of what we mean by those phrases. So I'm going to try and unpack that a little bit. And then, as Wayne says, I can share what the application of this approach looks like in the terms of some of the issues that the Galapagos Islands are facing today. So I think we all know where we stand, but this is important because where we stand is in a moment in time facing huge amounts of different compounding, cascading challenges. And this is why we need systems change. Incremental change isn't going to allow us to respond appropriately to the climate crisis. The quote you can see on the right here is one that I use quite a lot. I find that even today, when I'm talking, particularly, I have to say, to senior executives about the climate crisis, there's some detachment and lack of understanding that it's already here. And so I will often say to people, does anybody have a 4 or 5-year-old? And use this quote to spell out, this is the future for that 4 or 5-year-old that's baked in. All these many times more greater incidents of extreme weather events. So if any of you are struggling to get the message around climate change out to senior people, this quote works very well in that regard. And so where things stand is we need to really rethink how we wire our economy, how we wire our society, how we think about our interaction with the environment. And so this need to raise our ambition really underpins all of the work we do at Forum. And in order to understand how and in what ways we want to raise our ambition, it's useful to know where we've come from. And I just find this graphic useful to explain the evolution of sustainability from 20 or so years ago, where it really was about minimizing negative impacts, moving through to zero harm, maybe 15 years ago. And then net positive was a concept that we worked a lot on at Forum for the Future. I helped co-write some of the principles around net positive. And for a long time, I thought net positive was a pretty cool concept, this notion of putting more back into society, into the environment than we take out. But then it became apparent unless we shift how underlying systems work, we're going to need to keep putting more back in than we take out. Really simple analogy. If you imagine a bucket with a hole in it, unless we fix that hole, then we're going to need to keep adding liquid into that bucket. And so that's why at Forum, 6, 7 years ago, we started to talk about this notion of a just and regenerative future, which is, in my sort of simple world, sustainability 4.0, which is actually understanding how do we reconfigure the systems that we rely on to create the conditions in which both people and planet thrive into the long term. And unpacking just and regenerative then, it's got different dimensions. It recognizes planetary boundaries. We're obviously overshooting many of those boundaries. Right now, we reach Earth Overshoot Day in Europe, middle of the year, maybe July. That's the point in the year that we've used a planet's worth of resources. Critically, just and regenerative is about creating and distributing value in new ways, not just economic value, but environmental and societal value. This is where new business models, such as payment for ecosystems, business models are so important. And critically, this approach is about understanding we're a fundamental part of nature. Many of the challenges that we face today come from the fact that we've disconnected ourselves from the natural systems that we are completely dependent upon. And critically, what we've done with this notion of just and regenerative is really elevated the social dimension of sustainability. In 1.0, 2.0, the social dimension wasn't even there. And we know that we need to interconnect environmental and social issues. But critically, just and regenerative is underpinned by both collaboration and system change. And why system change? Why systems? This is one of my favorite illustrations. We've been using it for many years at Forum, but for me, it encapsulates why we need to take a systems approach. We'd like to think that solving problems is a linear process, that we can plot a very clear, precise course from point A to point B. But actually, the world isn't like that. The world is a set of complicated, messy systems. And the fact that we ignore that complication means that we tend to avoid root causes, we tend to design for incremental change. This is one of my favorite quotations from Donella Meadows, who was one of the really early practitioners in systems change and just was a fabulous person in terms of really honing this concept and making it relatable and practical. She also gets the prize for the most complicated sentence, which is the first one on the top here. But this quote for me encapsulates why we need to think in systems and why the fact that we struggle to think in systems means that we're not designing the breakthrough change that we know we need to see. So what is a system? The classic definition is any group of interacting related parts with a function. And so a simple system is a bicycle, two wheels, a seat, a handlebar, pedals if you're lucky, with a function to enable you to move from A to B. A more complicated system is a transportation system, such as we have here. Here we have the interplay now of public transport, private transport, people, but still it's a system with the same function, which is allow mobility through a city. A system can be a socioeconomic system, such as the food system, the energy system. It can be a social system, such as education. It can be an ecological system, such as the ocean. The fact is, the world is full of these nested systems. And critically, when we're thinking about how we shift systems, we need to understand, well, what is it that we're trying to do? And actually, what we're trying to do is to reorientate the configuration of those systems to a different function. So, a really light-hearted example here, we have the bicycle. We've taken off the seat, we've put a block of wood on the top, and we've reorientated the function of that bicycle. It's now a table. In the other picture, we've put the bicycle on its side, we've put it in a wire frame, and it's now a gate. So systems change is about reorientating the flows of a system to a different function. And when we hear, when we're listening to the news, that, well, the food system is broken, the health system is broken, the economy is broken, from a systems perspective, that actually isn't strictly true. A system will do what it was set up to do. And in the case of our global economy, it was set up to ensure rapid economic development after the devastation of the Second World War. It placed growth at the heart of that system, profit maximization. And what we're seeing right now is a redefinition of the economy to broaden out the goals of the economy to include positive benefits for people, for nature. And just to sort of explain then how that shift is happening and why defining the goals of the system is so important, if we think about traditional investment, that is maintaining the current system, the current economic system. ESG investing, where we're investing, incorporating an analysis of environmental and social risk, is beginning to broaden out the goals of the system because we're looking at how we account for environmental and social issues, but it's still the same system. Whereas impact investing, where we're investing not just for economic return, but for creating positive environmental and societal value, is shifting the goals of the system. So in order to really enable systems begin to reconfigure and to flow towards a different goal, we have to be really explicit about that, about what that goal is. And so for the global economy, being explicit that actually we need an economy that doesn't just work for a very narrow definition of fiduciary duty, but broadens out that definition of fiduciary duty to include benefits of people and planet, that is so critical. And understanding the purpose of a system enables you to reframe the challenge. This is a small example here from some work that we did in London, actually, a few years ago now. The challenge was single-use plastics washing up onto the shores of the Thames. And so we were approached along with other nonprofits. How do we solve for the issue of single-use plastics? And the systems approach tells us that actually the real root cause of this is people want hydration. So how do we offer hydration in new ways? Because the purpose of the plastic wasn't just to generate plastic, it was to give us access to water. And so through a collaboration with other organizations, hydration points were introduced into London. That reduces the need for single-use plastics, but we've gone to the heart of the problem. And so thinking about the purpose of the system enables that reframe and getting to the root causes of some of the challenges that we're trying to address. And then confusingly, system change is both an outcome, so we can reorientate systems to a new set of goals. It's a process. It doesn't happen without very deliberate design, but it's also a practice. And Wayne and I are going to be launching a podcast soon, and we're going to be exploring a lot of these dimensions in much more detail. But it's really important to understand that really tackling system change is both about articulating a goal, it's about designing a process where you need to build in lots of adaptive capacity, but it's also about how we approach things as individuals. And so then just to kind of finish up with, well, how do systems change? Many frameworks out there. The one that we use a lot at Fora and the one that I use a lot in my work is something called the multi-level perspective. It's not new. I think it might be over 20 years old, but it's a way of understanding how systems work. And any system, be it the energy system or the food system, tends to operate at three levels. You've got that landscape level of a system where big picture, slow moving trends will play out. Then what's called the regime, which is the mainstream, where we undertake our day-to-day activities. And then excitingly, any system has a niche where innovations tend to bubble away. And systems begin to change when those landscape pressures begin to be felt in the mainstream, coupled with innovation bubbling up from the niche and also reaching the right price point in the regime. But critically, the magic ingredient here is people willing to do things differently. So if we think about the energy transition, we've known about the science around a changing climate for decades, but it's really only been in the last 10 years or so where we've had that coming together of we know about the science, we can see the impacts of climate change on the world around us. Renewable energy is now cheaper in most parts of the world than fossil fuels, and we've now got, in most places, not all, the political will and certainly the will of the private sector, the will of communities to do things differently. And so if we take the energy transition, we are in that accelerated phase of systems change. And a word about that phase, it's not linear, as you might be fooled into thinking looking at this graph. It is extraordinarily messy. And that's why oftentimes at the moment things feel quite volatile. In that accelerated phase of system change, that's why it feels that way. And so, in terms of the strategies then that we can use to design for system change, in that startup phase, we have to make the case for change. We share information differently through the system. We're creating that innovation. In that middle phase of accelerated systems change, we need to advocate to shift the goal of the system. That's why the COP process, even though it's flawed, is important because it's articulating a different set of goals for the food system, the energy system. Collaboration is critical. No one organization, there are a couple of exceptions, that might be a question, can change a system on its own. We need collaboration across the system, and we need the right incentives, the right financing, business models, access to capital. Once a system begins to stabilize to a new set of goals, that's where we need to shift societal norms, culture becomes really important, and we need new rules of the game. Systems change processes often fail because we introduce the policy too early in the process. We haven't created the conditions, the societal acceptance of a new way of operating for that system to stabilize. Looking at regenerative agriculture as an example, we know we can see the case for change. I think it's been well made. In many parts of the world, we're looking at only 20 more harvests because of the poor soil quality. There's lots of work to influence the goals of the system. So many platforms looking at how we collaborate to scale regenerative agriculture. And then amazing financing instruments like sustainability bonds, such as the one that HSB has with Olam Agri. And through looking at the links between climate, health, and nature, we're beginning to shift consumers, citizens' understanding of this dimension, and legislation is coming in to support this transition. But this is the second reason why, at this moment in time, the world feels so messy. The closer, and this isn't my phrase, but I use it a lot, the closer you get to a system changing, the closer you get to that stabilization of a new system, the harder the resisting forces kick back. And that's what's happening right now. Powerful, well-funded forces that don't want the emergence of a new agricultural system. They don't want the emergence of a new energy system. And that's another reason why this moment in time feels quite volatile. So that is your System Change 101, a ready reckoner into what we mean by systems, how systems change. Obviously, huge amounts more to share there. But coming back to this moment in time, it does feel very perilous and fraught with complexity and difficult. But we have an active choice to make, and really embracing system change, or as Donella Meadow talked about, dancing with systems, enables us to choose and chart a different path. So back to you, Wayne.
Thanks, Sally. That's a really, really helpful introduction to the concept behind systems change. And I'm delighted that Danella Meadows came up a few times. And in fact, I will also end with her. But I'd like to then just link rather nicely to what you've been saying by looking a little bit more at the dynamics of how systems do sometimes change. And and then we will have a little discussion about the Galapagos. So some of you may have seen this picture before. It's become a bit of a classic, but this is New York City in 1900, Fifth Avenue. It's all horse-drawn carriages and one motor vehicle. 1913, same street, all motor vehicles, one horse-drawn carriage. And the insight here is that systems appear to be very difficult to change. We get all of that resistance often. But then when they do reach an inflection point, they can change extremely fast. In this case, major city of the world completely changing its transport system within 13 years. And in fact, this is not an exception, but is the rule for how innovation-led systems change happens. The old system goes into decline and the new system emerges. And as we can see, these opposite S curves, which form an X curve, are really how we experience it as well. Because if you think about change, it often appears to be happening very, very slowly. The new system really doesn't seem to be shifting. The old system seems to be hanging on for dear life for an age. And then we reach these inflection points and the exponential change kicks in. And not only does the new system rise extremely fast, but the old system collapses. Some analysis suggests that it collapses even faster than the new system rises. And we're not very well trained to think of change in this way. Somehow our minds struggle with exponential growth to understand it. But we have the whole of history to look at and all the technology changes we've seen. I'm just sharing a few examples here, whether it's going from cast iron to steel, from steam to electricity, coal to gas, or indeed the horse to the car. They all have this kind of X curve of change. And we can see some very practical examples of this right now. Sally mentioned already the growth of renewables. So one of the things that happens as those cost curves start to fall with scaling, we see a rapid competitiveness emerging. So in the last 10 years, solar's fallen by over 75%. And not only does the costs fall, but also the technology itself improves. In this case, solar cell efficiency going up over the last 10 years. And as a result, we get this exponential growth, compound annual growth rate here of nearly 30%. We see the same in wind. So offshore wind costs falling by over 70% in the last 10 years, onshore continuing to fall. And the performance of the technology itself going up. In the case of wind, it's the size of the blades themselves. And once again, we see that compound annual growth rate. We don't always notice it perhaps at the beginning because, if you double one, that's two. If you double two, that's four. It doesn't always feel like it's going very fast, but remember, it is climbing up that curve. We see the same happening with batteries. Nearly 80% drop in the costs over the last 10 years. And once again, the performance going up. In this case, it's cell density that's the key performance indicator. And a remarkable growth rate here, starting a little bit later than solar and wind, but nearly 70% compound annual growth rate. So why does this happen? Why do we get this rapid emergence and at the same time a collapse of the old system? It's because of feedback loops, which is a very key systems thinking or systems mapping concept, basically, that we get reinforcing feedback loops. And in terms of the new system, what happens is that we're getting more options on the table. We get those economies of scale, more capacity, capability, more public acceptance, and lower costs. At the same time, that results in higher revenues, margins, investment, and government support. At the same time, the old system is experiencing exactly the opposite. think of the fossil fuel industry right now. They are hanging on for dear life. They're doubling down, adding their investments. We've even seen it at the latest COP in Belém. But their economies of scale are going against them. It is becoming more expensive to extract fossil fuels, and public acceptance is clearly going down. As a result, margins go down. There's less investment going into fossil fuels. At the moment, roughly double is going into renewables as compared to fossil fuels. Governments supporting it less, and less social license to operate. So the combination of these two gives us that exponential curve. Just to add two more insights, if you like, and that's that we understand systems because we've been able to study them, especially in nature. And when you look at the science underlying the systems, we find that there are some principles. One of the things I discovered very early on in sustainability was everybody talked about systems thinking. And when you asked what that meant, they said, well, it just means everything is connected. And that's interesting, but not very helpful, especially when you look at the spaghetti diagram that Sally showed. It's a complex world. What do we do with that? And systems mapping is an interesting and useful exercise, but as soon as you start to map real systems, they very quickly become spaghetti diagrams. So what we need is some underlying principles that we can use to test whether systems are healthy or not. And I've extracted 6 here. I won't go through them in any detail, just so that you know that they exist. Complexity is all about the interconnections. So in fact, having more relationships, more of a network effect in any system is usually extremely good for that system. It makes it more robust, more resilient. Having circularity designed in, we know our global economy is doing what it was set up to do, which is to be a linear system. Less than 10%, the estimates are around about 7% circular today, so 93% linear, whereas in nature, of course, everything is designed to be circular. Creativity is designed into our systems as well, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit in our discussion on Galapagos, which after all was an inspiration for Darwin and evolution. Coherence, also important. Then there needs to be a purpose. Sally talked a lot about the goal of the system being so critical. And then convergence, a little bit what I was introducing with the innovation, where things reinforce one another, and therefore we get a rapid emergence of a new state. And finally, there needs to be some continuity. We need to design systems to be able to survive and thrive over the long term. And there are different ways that different systems do that. So we have a way to test whether the systems we're designing and changing are actually scientifically built to thrive. The last little model or framework I want to end then with is from Donella Meadows once again, that great system scientist. And one of her contributions was to come up with the levers of change in a system. She actually identified 12 levers of change. This is summarized here and distilled a little bit, but the important point being that change is always like an iceberg, where what we see and we can sort of get our hands on is what is above the surface, but the much larger and deeper part of the system is often invisible, going all the way down to mental models. So how people see the world, their belief systems, their value systems. If we can change these, then we have a much bigger effect on changing the system itself, but they're the hardest to change at the same time. And the takeaway really is that we need to be working at all levels of the system, the things we can get our hands on, like policies and practices, but then going deeper and deeper into the fundamentals of the system, because if we can change those, then we get a bigger effect in the end. So I'm going to stop there. And I hope that's been useful for you all to give you a real canter over the ground of what systems are and how they change. Let's try and bed it down a little bit, Sally, into real practice now. And let's start with where you are and where I've also visited, which is the Galapagos Islands. And I mentioned that, of course, it was one of the inspirations for Darwin and his theory of evolution. And, so there was a theme of change there always as a sort of form of instruction. But what's your view? How does the Galapagos Islands provide us with some insights into systems change?
Yeah, well, I think the Darwin finches are a really brilliant example of that. So here in the Galapagos, there's lots of roads. There's Darwin Avenue, and there's the Charles Darwin Research Foundation also here. Because whilst Charles Darwin didn't articulate the theory of evolution while he was here, the work that he did here informed that thinking because he was here going between the islands and I've been reading about this obviously as a way of preparing to come to the Galapagos. And Charles Darwin was actually a geologist. He wasn't even a biologist. And he set off on HMS Beagle from Plymouth with a right-hand man who was the guy that he employed to go and this will seem a bit odd, to shoot things so that Charles Darwin could then stuff them and analyze them. And 4 years into the voyage, they reached the Galapagos Island. And Charles Darwin was going around the islands and noticing all these small birds. Some were clearly finches, but others he thought they might be wrens, they might be blackbirds. Anyway, he got his chap to go and shoot them. Charles Darwin then kind of stuffed them and was really confused by these birds. Really, really confused because he could see that some were related, some weren't related. And so he came back to the UK eventually and dropped off these birds at the Zoological Society and said, I really don't know what to make of these birds. Some look related, but some don't. And there was a taxidermist at Zoological Society at that point. This is like 1840s, something like that. And this guy really started to understand that actually these were all related. In fact, there were 13 different types of finches. So they weren't wrens, they weren't blackbirds, there were different types of finches. And you could tell the difference because of their beaks. And what had happened is these finches have evolved on the different islands, and the different islands are different systems. So islands have very different types of flora and fauna, and the birds over time had adapted to the system of that island. And you see it going around. Some of the finches have really big beaks because they need those big beaks to kind of get the seeds that are on those islands out of the trees. Others little ground finches, tiny little beaks. And so what that shows us is that actually the islands are a set of nested systems. There are systems within systems. And in terms of explaining how systems work and theories of systems, these islands are just a brilliant example. And today, we can see a lot of the work that's happening in the islands is grounded in theories of systems practice. And very specifically, there's an island here called Floriana. The inhabitant is a wildly high number of 140 inhabitants. It is this beautiful, beautiful island. But as with many of the islands here, has really suffered in terms of loss of biodiversity, loss of fauna because of invasive species, particularly rats. Fun fact about a rat: one rat leads to 3,000 rats within the spirit of 12 in the space of 12 months, and the rats will eat the vegetation, will eat the eggs of the nesting birds, and so on. And so Floriana has this big ambition to enable eradication of rats from the island. To do that, you need a systems approach because the solution has been dropping bait from helicopters. And that clearly needs really clear thinking through in terms of capturing the native species, keeping them safe, working at what's that critical threshold when you release them back into the wild, the populations will rebound. Thinking about secondary pollution, so short-eared owls are still in captivity on I'd like to say San Cristobal, but it might be Santa Cruz. But anyway, they're in captivity to keep them safe. And then clearly you need to work with the farmers to shift their farming practices. So Floriana is an example of system change in practice. And the idea behind the restoration of Floriana was conceptualized 10 years ago. And actually the focus was really on conservation, on the fauna and flora, but today we're now understanding that we need to bring the social dimension in. And so a lot of what's happening right now is to sort of re-articulate the goal of the Floriana project and the goal of that systemic change from not just about conserving the animals, but actually creating the conditions in Floriana where, yes, the animals will thrive, but also people will thrive. Here in the Galapagos, you have a community, many of whom can't swim. They're very dislocated from the tourism activities here. And the work of the Galapagos Conservation Trust is to really bring together the environmental issues with the social issues to work towards a goal of the system of the Galapagos, where the systems of the Galapagos are reconfigured, redesigned to enable people and the planet to thrive. So it's like a living experiment in
Yeah,
systems change.
yeah. In that sense, islands are perfect for systems, thinking, because on islands you see the effects, more immediately. With islands, of course, there is no away, and that's this. We're a global island, the Earth, but it's hard for us to always see the impacts. Whereas often islands have to look at their impacts because they're so immediate. A couple of things you sparked in what you said, which I think again are underlying principles of systems. The one is that systems are very adaptable naturally, and very resilient even, which is good news for us. Of course, we're really battering some of our ecological systems, but they are designed, all systems, including social systems, are designed to be adaptable and to be resilient. I remember when I was visiting the Galapagos, I think it was Bartholomew Island that we visited, which is very volcanic. I mean, it's basically an island of lava that is now solidified, and it's barren. But when you go onto the island, you find one or two little cactuses, and they're the first footprint of life, of organic life on that island. And you can see how powerful life is in actually, you know, um, propagating itself, and getting that foothold. And who knows how long it'll take before those are flourishing again. But some of the other things that you really highlighted there, which I think are so crucial. One is that there are often unintended consequences in systems when we intervene in systems without
Mm.
thinking through how things are connected. You gave a good example there, and it's often been the case where we try to biologically control for pests, and we have this knock-on effect if we haven't thought it through. The other, let's say, simpler example was a few years ago, biofuels seemed like a great solution for everything, roughly carbon neutral, but it had this unintended consequence on food prices because we were using the same land as for our crops to grow stuff to burn, which in the end didn't make a huge amount of sense, but we hadn't thought it through. And then the other is, I think, the importance of social in the systems that we often work with and think about in
Mm.
sustainability. It's an old mistake we make, and I think it's because sustainability largely emerged from an ecological movement, and then you had social responsibility, which was more the social side. But we still find people who talk about sustainability as if it's only the environment. And of course, it isn't, and no environmental systems change can be successful, a regenerative project, for example, without bringing the community on board.
Yep.
I know that you spent some time actually training the community yesterday, I think it was, working with them. So any insights from that? I mean, it's often the
Yeah.
hardest part, right?
So yesterday I was lucky enough to be invited to actually two events. We had a workshop in the morning with community leaders, different non-profit leaders on the islands, looking at two of the real key challenges present here today. One is plastic pollution. So Galapagos has got actually quite strict rules about the use of single-use plastics, but because we live in an interconnected system, plastic gets washed in from thousands of miles away and washed into the shores. And we visited a research station and saw the nest of a flightless cormorant. So these flightless cormorants are beautiful creatures, and they're now making nests out of plastic, and it's just heartbreaking. And I have a picture of what a nest should look like. So sea urchins, kind of natural materials in the nest, but what they can look like, it's full of plastic pollution, netting, and one nest, a flightless cormorant had basically pulled apart a GoPro and made it a nest out of a GoPro, which is just, that's not going to help in the breeding. So yesterday morning we were looking about, what might the solutions be around plastic pollution, and then the other big challenge and opportunity right now is what's the future of tourism on the island? These islands, they're fragile, delicate ecosystems. There isn't the infrastructure to cope with huge influxes of visitors, yet tourism is the big part of the economy. So how do you navigate that future for tourism? And so what we did in the morning is we used the multi-level perspective, which I shared earlier, those strategies for change, and asked in terms of plastic pollution and tourism, if we look at those strategies, what does it tell us about what we might need to do differently and do more of? And with the plastic challenge, using the framework really highlighted the need for integrated policies. So there are policies on the island around avoiding use of some plastics, but there's no take back facility. And so we could see that there was a need for that integrated policy, and also a need for local policy, but regional policy, because, and this is part of the work that the Galapagos Conservation Trust do, is advocacy at an international level for the plastics treaty, because the Galapagos on its own isn't going to help solve for single-use plastic. So it reinforced some of the strategies that are currently being brought forward here in terms of dealing with plastic pollution. And then on tourism, back to what you were saying, Wayne, in terms of that community engagement, what was really clear yesterday is the case for change in terms of rethinking how tourism operates on the island isn't well understood amongst the different parts of the ecosystem. And one of the big takeaways from yesterday's session was at that startup phase of system change where you need to make the case for change, it's so important to make sure that that case for change is reaching all the different parts of the system. And here in the Galapagos, there are, people in communities that don't necessarily see why that needs to change. So the MLP, as I lovingly call it, really helped understand how we sharpen some strategies and others. And then the second event yesterday was actually celebrating 30 years of the Galapagos Conservation Trust. And I talked a lot about just and regenerative approaches to sustainability, and hopefully back to your levers for change, which I wholeheartedly believe in. The deepest lever for change is our mindset, and just encouraging people to think differently about how we go about systems change. So lots of insights, lots of takeaways. And I think kind of for me, the three big ones are: check that your case for change is reaching all parts of the system. We assume that it is, but often that it isn't. Second, avoid false choices. So in the tourism debate, there's often it can be land or it can be ocean-based tourism. It needs to be both. We need to see the whole in any systems transition. And critically, don't make assumptions about what approaches to use when. So what was also clear yesterday is here in the Galapagos, and this is true in many system change approaches, we go too soon on pressing the policy button, and we haven't created the cultural acceptance and that shift in societal norms, that deep lever for change. And some of the interventions here on the Galapagos have failed, policy changes have failed because actually the system wasn't ready.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, really, really good example. And it makes me think of a visit I had very early on in my career when I just started KPMG Sustainability Services. In fact, my first project was in Mauritius, and it was a tourism carrying capacity study, which in some ways was very wise of them to even ask for that, to say, it may be that you can have such a thing as too many tourists or too many of the wrong kinds of tourists. And I think it links in also to another thing you mentioned in your presentation around incentives and goals. So what are we really aiming for, and what are we measuring? If we were measuring, for example, only number of tourists or revenue from tourists, we might maximize or optimize a system which really isn't what we wanted and may actually undermine the whole reason that people come. You have too many tourists, you destroy the environment, and your ecotourism collapses. So it's another example of how, we really want to be thinking through those goals and those incentives and the whole system before we, as you say, press the button on the policy side. We are open to any questions from the floor. So I think we're a small enough group that if you want to speak, you can just raise your hand and we'll be able to unmute you. So please feel free to jump in, and if you have any questions while you're thinking, and until I see a hand go up. Sally, we're doing this as a kind of slight preview, or a little sneak preview of a podcast we're going to launch called System Shift. Just your view on why is this important right now? There are lots of podcasts out there, including sustainability podcasts. Why this one that we're going to do together? How do you see the value of that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I know you know the answer, but for the purpose of everyone else on this session today, we need to demystify this notion of system change. A lot of what is written about system change practice is hugely academic, using words that no one really understands. And when you come to apply it in practice, it's really difficult. And what I really hope we can do is demystify system change, make it relatable, make it actionable, because unless we get serious about systemic change now, it scares me what might happen next. But on the flip side, I'm excited by the possibilities of what would happen if decision makers and citizens around the world became system change experts. Boy, we would then be trucking towards a future that we wanted. So, yes, there are lots of podcasts out there, lots of podcasts on sustainability, but unpacking system change, unpacking system change practices, making it easier for people to adopt those practices in all settings. So, people in communities, as citizens, as leaders of businesses, is something I feel quite passionate about, and is something that I feel is really needed now.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it, is helping people to understand that we have agency, we are part of the system. And I'm sure you get this question a lot, but one of the reasons I'm excited about this new podcast is because understanding systems change gives me hope for our ability to change the
Yes.
system and the fact that the system is changing. So we do live in a time, I think, of huge anxiety, especially among younger generations, of a sense of hopelessness, of being overwhelmed by the problems, which is not to say that the problems don't exist. But understanding how systems change and are changing, I think, gives us a great grounding for hope. And
Mm.
it's not false hope, it's not blind optimism. It's based on the fact that systems have always changed. As we've been discussing today, systems can often change very fast after seeming not to change at all for a long time. And we can get these tipping points that are not only the system collapsing, which is what we read in the news, but positive tipping points. And
Yeah.
then even possibly cascading tipping points where one tipping point results in another. So, I think there's a great that's one of the important reasons for doing this podcast. And as you say, to demystify it. I mean, I've been immersing in the science of systems for a long time with wonderful people. We may even get him on, like Fridtjof Capra. But when you read his books and you listen to him or other experts, you get concepts like autopoiesis. Now, that's a really important concept in systems. It basically means that systems have self-creating processes. But if we're going to stick to that kind of jargon, we're going to get nowhere, right? We just need to talk very
I've never heard
understandable.
of that phrase ever.
Yeah, exactly. So, we need to make this something for everybody. So let's take the question from Harold. Thanks, Harold,
Yeah.
for
Thank you,
that. And I
Harold,
know
for the
that
question.
Sally's itching to answer that. So
I am, because it
yes, go
is.
for it.
So yeah, so many examples. So first of all, regenerative tourism for me is really operating to a set of principles and approach to tourism that isn't just based on numbers and economic return, but is also based on building and enabling thriving, healthy communities, restoring ecosystems, enabling those ecosystems to flourish. And there's a lot happening here on the Galapagos. There are particular cruise operators that really abide by those principles. Just yesterday, we went up into the highlands. When you think about the Galapagos, you think of sun and sand and sea, but actually there are highlands in many of the islands, and it's actually really wet and very, very green. And we went to a ranch operated by a couple who are really committed to regenerative tourism. It's fully organic. They have rewilded the habitat. 70% of the construction materials for their hotel is local. They've actually used volcanic lava to build certain elements of the property. And in terms of the economics and the profits that they make, they are working hand in hand with the community to really enable that money to trickle to the communities. So as with any systems transition, there are pockets of brilliant practice here. And the challenge and the massive opportunity right now, and this is at the heart of much of the work of the GCT, is to really build that common consensus about what we mean by these principles of regenerative tourism and enable the whole system to embrace this practice and then the whole system to do something differently.
Yeah, exactly. I see we had also a comment and a part question from Ngan. Thank you. I know you're calling in from Vietnam. And it's really about, to what extent this is rooted in natural systems and in aligning with natural systems. And I think it absolutely is
Yeah.
both. We have to be with operating within natural systems that are flourishing, and of course connected to them and aligned with them. But I wanted to just make one small point, which is that we do often use natural systems as a metaphor for social systems. And although social systems are also living systems, they do operate slightly differently than natural systems. So, in natural systems, you get certain organizing principles which are kind of baked in through DNA and other things. In social systems, the real glue of the system is communication, is information. And so, that allows us also to work slightly differently. So it's not 100% transferable, the entire science of natural
Hmm.
systems into social systems, but there is a lot to take from both. I see also a lovely comment from Elspeth about indigenous science,
Yes.
and what's your experience of that? And if I'm correct in remembering from my visit to Galapagos, and I met some of the locals, if you like, who'd spent their whole life there. Galapagos, I think, is fairly, let's call it, recently colonized in the last few hundred years. So I don't think it had an original indigenous population. You correct me if I'm wrong, but there are people who have been living there, some
Yeah.
for many generations. So did you find some local wisdom in the community itself?
Absolutely. You're right. When Darwin arrived in the Galapagos, I think he was famously quoted as, "What a perilous volcanic landscape. How can anything ever live here?" Because, yeah, it's a tough, tough, tough ecosystem. And so I think you're right. I don't think there was an indigenous population in the way that there is in other parts of Ecuador. But yet people were coming here from the mid 18th century. And people have learned how to sort of really farm and flourish in this landscape, um, in terms of, what crops to grow, when to grow them. So there's a definite sense of local knowledge. And again, what's happening right now is to bring that local knowledge into the conversations, particularly around tourism. Because what has really struck me is, and I first came here 30 years ago, and managed to blagged my way onto the islands as a backpacker, took the cheapest cabin on a boat, and it was extraordinary. But the tourism industry was completely separate from the community. And now there's a really deliberate attempt to sort of foster connections between the tourism community and the tourists and the local community, and to share that local wisdom and to share that local knowledge. And, it may only be 100, 150 years old, but it's there. So there's definitely a sense of right now on the islands, how do we create, and excuse the metaphor, the system where all boats rise, where actually everyone flourishes and we connect the system. And by connecting the system, we're unlocking energy for change in a way that we maybe have not seen before.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we're in the last minute and we will end on time. So, thank you for all joining us. Please do look out for that new podcast that we will launch next year. We will also be sharing the recording of this webinar. And so let me just give you, Sally, your sort of 5-word takeaway. What's your takeaway message as we close this session?
I'm going to quote Donella Meadows. You can't control systems, but you can dance with them.
Wonderful. And mine would be rather similar. Why not be the ripple that becomes the wave? So thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon. And please do stay connected with us and watch this space. Thanks, Sally. Thanks, everybody. We'll close the session.
Thank you. Thanks so much.